This is not the computer I thought I'm gonna build. Well, not in this form anyway. And that's why you're seeing me taking apart the computer in the first place. Yeah, I just need a real estate from the old tenant. Funny thing about the computer that was previously in here, it was only here for about a week, just for testing, and I'm moving it up to a better case. I mean, that was my old 2700X, which worked absolutely fine, and the temperatures were great with that water cooler. But while the water cooler is going to remain in situ, I do feel that the overall airflow was a little bit restricted for what I was trying to do. Obviously, with the 3200G that is going in here, that is definitely not going to be any sort of a problem. Mostly breeze through the build process. And what I will say is there is no doubt that this is an entry-level machine. I feel that it's got a lot to offer, especially with running it with 16 gigs of RAM, an SSD, and best of all, a water cooler. Apart from the obvious bonus of making this machine dead silent, that water cooler is also going to let us get the most out of this processor. I was so confident that nothing can go wrong. Well, it's simple enough build that I even did a lot more cable management that I usually do during the initial build. I personally like to get the PC up and running and do some preliminary testing before I bother with making it look pretty. But as we shall see, this really posed no challenge, as everything pretty much worked out of the box. The true stars of the show are definitely going to be the benchmarks, so see you there. Now, I recently built a 3400G PC, and it's gonna be very interesting for me personally to see how these two compare. I'm going to put a link in the video description to a table that compares them side by side. That is, if I remember. First up is Heaven, a 1080p medium preset, and although this is a older benchmark, I think it did a really good job here. I was well impressed with the graphical processor, how well it managed to keep the frame times in check. Next up is Superposition at 1080p. This really shows that it is a much newer benchmark, as the frame rate really takes a dip to a 14 FPS-ish average, but again the frame times remain really consistent. First actual game we're taking a look at is Fortnite, and at 1080p with medium preset and epic draw distance with the 100% resolution scale, we are getting a very nice 45 FPS. That is really good. I also tried competitive settings and those work much better as expected, yielding above 85 FPS on average. Next, Rocket League, which is another esports title. It ran well enough at 30 FPS with Full HD and all the eye candy turned on. But to be fair, I think that you need to go down either in resolution or in settings to get a more enjoyable experience. I mean, this title should have 35-40 FPS without dips. And thankfully that is 100% achievable. GTA 5 is an older title, so it ran very well at Full HD with medium and high settings. I think that with a little bit of resolution and settings tweaking can easily get to above 60 FPS if desired, but personally I think that 35 to 45 FPS is perfectly playable. This is after all an entry level APU and not a screaming 3080 Ti. Oh, did I say Ti? Well, come January the 12th, I guess we're gonna find out together. I tried Cyberpunk 2077, I really did, but despite my best efforts, I think that while it is technically playable, it's not really an enjoyable experience. The resolution and the settings had to be turned down so low that it looks more like GTA 3 than a 2020 flagship game. But it only gets better from here. Horizon Zero Dawn was a very pleasant surprise that ran me 32 FPS on average, and I think I'm gonna call this one really playable. The really surprising bit is that I did not notice any sort of texture artifacting that plagued my first playthrough with the RX 570, to the point where you can see that I actually preferred the experience on the APU than on the dedicated GPU. I did promise that things would get better for AAA titles and they have, and Death Stranding is a prime example of that. Playing this game on 720p low settings, the game looked absolutely fantastic, and it ran really well to boot. Enabling Fidelity FX can nab you an extra 5 or 10 FPS, but I think the blurriness that it introduces is not really worth it. This is a sightseeing game more than anything else, so it's gonna be a good experience. Although I wasn't quite able to tweak the settings in order to get below the VRAM limit, Assassin's Creed Valhalla was another good example of a nice surprise. It ran with 32 FPS on average, and I think it was really playable. Mind you, this was the benchmark. Actual gameplay FPS was around 38. Last but not least is a Cinebench R20 run, and while initially I was disappointed by the completion speed, I then had to remember that my expectations were set against the 5960X, and the 3200G only costs about 8% of that, on the used market of course, versus a new processor, and it somehow completely upstaged an FX 8350, which is technically an 8-core processor that still sells for a silly amount of money today. And that's it, hope you enjoyed the video.